Do you know how arrogant and stubborn Japan was at the end of World War II? This video truly recreates the full details of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the US military back then. At 1:37 a.m. on August 6, 1945, 3 U.S. Army weather planes departed from Tennyson Island in preparation for a reconnaissance trip to the Japanese mainland. Eventually, due to weather and distance, the military abandoned Niigata, which was located to the northeast, and instead targeted the cities of Nagasaki, Hiroshima, and Kokura. At 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945, 3 B-29 Superfortress bombers of the U.S. Army's 509th Combined Brigade took off from Tennyson Island Air Force Base in preparation for a flight to the mainland of Japan. The entire flight formation was commanded by Colonel Paul Betties, who flew the Enola Gay bomber, which was loaded with the famous Little Boy atomic bomb. By 5:05 a.m., the 3 bombers on the mission had flown over Iwo Jima. The entire flight formation consisted of, in addition to the Enola Gay, which contained the atomic bomb, the Great Artist, which was responsible for measuring the data of the explosion, and the Evil Bomber, which was responsible for taking pictures of the explosion. After making short adjustments over Iwo Jima, they began to continue their flight to the Japanese mainland. At 7:09 a.m., the 3 weather planes that departed first arrived over the target city almost simultaneously. The weather plane over Hiroshima was the first to send a telegram to the bomber group behind it, saying that the clouds over Hiroshima were very thin and the weather was perfect for dropping bombs, so the crews immediately set their bombing targets for Hiroshima. At that moment, however, the Japanese suddenly spotted the weather planes in the air and immediately sounded the air raid siren. However, the citizens of Hiroshima did not react and did not even bother to go to the air raid shelters. At 7:31 a.m., the weather planes left Hiroshima City and the air raid sirens were soon lifted. 8:09 a.m. The bombers behind were coming in fast and furious, and they were still 10 minutes away from reaching the skies over Hiroshima. Colonel Betties immediately ordered all planes to climb to an altitude of 31,060 feet and to make final bombing preparations. At 8:10 a.m., Japanese radar caught the intrusion of the B-29 bombers over the city of Hiroshima, and a few minutes later, the Hiroshima City Military Control District Command intended to issue an air raid warning. By this time, however, the Enola Gay had already flown over Hiroshima City at an altitude of 9,632 meters, an altitude, however, that was beyond the reach of Japanese interceptors and anti-aircraft guns. At 8:12 a.m. the T-bridge over the Ota River in central Hiroshima came into view of the pilots, and the crew then made final preparations and set the aircraft for automatic maneuvering. At 8:15 a.m., the timing device came into play, the bomb was dropped automatically, and the 4.3-ton boy began to fall from great heights. Immediately after the drop, Colonel Betties flew the plane around a 155-degree angle for the return flight. Hiroshima at this time was still bustling as usual, and many citizens who were accustomed to the air raids did not enter the air raid shelters, but looked up at the bombers in the sky, unaware that the countdown to their lives had already begun. The atomic bomb exploded at 8:15 a.m. Japan time, approximately 580 meters above the hospital southeast of Sajiso Bridge, after 43 seconds of parabolic motion. On this day, clocks across Hiroshima stopped at 8:16. The intense wave of light from the atomic bomb explosion blinded thousands of people, and the heat of more than 6,000 degrees reduced everything to ashes, killing 30,000 people in the explosion that day. After the flash, sound wave and mushroom-shaped smoke cloud, a sea of fire and smoke enveloped the city. Within a radius of 14 square kilometers, 60,000 houses were all destroyed. Even the US bombers that had already returned to their flights felt the shock wave of the explosion. Hours after the explosion, US President Harry S. Truman gave the Japanese government an ultimatum, urging them to surrender immediately, but there was a delay in receiving a response. The Japanese side deliberated and decided that the war should continue. Such was their stubbornness and arrogance that the US had to continue to entertain them with atomic bombs. On the morning of August 9, 2 B-29 bombers went to the skies over Kokura and Nagasaki to scout the weather conditions, while on the other side 3 B-29 bombers on this bombing mission took off from the Tennyson Island Air Base. At the front of the formation was the Boxka, piloted by Major Sweeney, which was carrying an atomic bomb named Fat Man. In the center was the Great Artist, which was responsible for measuring the explosion data, and at the end was the Great Stink, which was responsible for taking images of the explosion. Now the formation of bombers is preparing to meet at the rendezvous point at Okishima, Japan, but a few hours into the flight an accident occurs. The atomic bomb's fuse monitor lights up red, indicating that the bomb's fuse has been activated. The crew immediately went to check it out, and after careful inspection realized that the ground technician had connected 2 circuit switches incorrectly, but the problem was quickly solved. At 9:10 a.m., the Berkuska was the first to arrive at the rendezvous point at Ujiu Island, followed by the Great Artist. The 2 first arriving bombers circled over Okishima for nearly 40 minutes without waiting for the last giant stinker bomber. This was because the giant stinker had gotten lost in the thick clouds and was unable to reach the rendezvous point, so the Berkuska and the great artist had to continue their mission. They began their flight in the direction of Kokura at 9:50 a.m., and right in the middle of the flight another piece of bad news came in, as the weather conditions over Kokura began to deteriorate. At 10:44 a.m., when the Berkuska and the great artist arrived over Kokura, they realized that the entire city was covered in clouds and black smoke, so the pilots were unable to locate the target point through the clouds. As the pilots were told before departure that they could only bomb with an optical targeting system and not with unreliable radar guidance. So the two bombers had to continue circling over Kokura until the weather conditions improved. After circling for 45 minutes, the danger returned. The bombers' radar detected Japanese fighters, so Major Sweeney decided to abandon the bombing of Kokura and instead target Nagasaki, 152 kilometers away. The two bombers immediately turned around and headed for Nagasaki, a city with a population of 286,000, and it is also one of the most important industrial cities in Japan, where many arsenals are gathered, such as Mitsubishi's torpedo manufacturing plant. After a flight of 34 minutes, the bombers arrived over Nagasaki, which unfortunately was also covered with dark clouds. After a period of circling, the clouds still showed no sign of dispersing, so the pilot had no choice but to turn on the radar navigation. Just then, however, a small gap appeared in the clouds 2 miles north of the ideal aiming point, and the bombardiers pressed the drop button after taking aim. Immediately after the drop was completed, the two bombers turned their planes around and prepared to return. The Fat Man A-bomb fell along an imaginary parabola and exploded at 11:02 a.m., 503 meters above the Villa tennis court, 3 kilometers from the center of Nagasaki. The massive shockwave and high temperatures directly killed 4,000 people, and 36% of the houses were completely burned or damaged. The two U.S. bombers that completed their mission continued to take off after making an emergency landing in Okinawa due to lack of fuel and returned to Tennyson Island Air Base. After the two atomic bombings, coupled with the full-scale counteroffensive by the Soviet Red Army and the Chinese Army against the Guangdong Army, the Japanese government could not afford to fight any longer, and finally on August 15, 1945, it could only announce its unconditional surrender.